Right, so let's bring you a load on all that's happened so far and all that's likely to happen all day today with Russian President Vladimir Putin in New Delhi for those all-important trade talks with the Indian ministerial delegation as well as the Russian ministerial and corporate delegation. Well, first up, Prime Minister Narendra Modi welcomed Russian President Vladimir Putin in New Delhi yesterday evening in what is being seen as a special gesture. Putin landed at the Air Force Station in Palam and was received personally by Prime Minister Modi ahead of the India-Russia annual summit scheduled for today. Now, this visit is significant as it is President Putin's first trip to India since the war in Ukraine began. The global spotlight is already on the conflict, especially with new peace efforts involving US President Donald Trump. Now, soon after arriving, President Putin headed to 7 Lok Kalyan Marg, the Prime Minister's residence, where the two leaders had a private dinner which lasted about 2 hours. Now, President Putin will receive a ceremonial welcome at Rashtrapati Bhavan today at 11 a.m. He will then visit Rajghat to pay tribute to Mahatma Gandhi by laying a wreath. Now, later at 11:50 a.m., the 23rd India-Russia annual summit will begin at Hyderabad House in New Delhi. After their talks, both leaders are expected to make statements to the press. Remember, the last time Putin visited India was in December 2021, which was a short visit and ahead of Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, post the summit, the Russian president will attend a business event in Bharat Mandapam. And finally, in the evening, President Draupadi Murmu will host him for a banquet dinner at Rashtrapati Bhavan, his last official engagement for the day. In a thoughtful gesture, Prime Minister Modi also presented President Putin with a copy of the Bhagavad Gita in Russian. In a post on X, Prime Minister Modi said the Gita's teachings inspire millions of people across the world. Prime Minister Modi also wrote that he's delighted to welcome his friend President Putin to India and looking forward to interactions later last evening as well as today. Now, India-Russia friendship is a time-tested one that has greatly benefited our people, said Prime Minister Modi. Now, remember, this visit is expected to deepen cooperation between India and Russia, not just in defense and energy, but across trade, space, technology, as both nations prepare for the crucial rounds of talks today. Well, we have a special panel of guests joining us this morning. In the studio, I'm joined by my colleague Arshi Dharan, editor international TV9 Network. We've also got with us Barnik Chitran Metra, PE investor, Chrysalis Venture Partners, and of course joining us remotely this morning, economist Mithali Nikore, joining in from Ahmedabad just before she takes a flight to Delhi, as we understand she's invited for those business talks later in the evening. Thank you, Mithali. We also have Ambassador Jayant Das Gupta, former Indian ambassador to WTO, and General Sanjay Kulkarni, a defense expert and a strategic affairs expert. Shri, let's begin first with understanding what's on stake, what's at stake here, what's on the table here, especially given the fact that India and Russia and their partnership is not a recent one, is not determined by who is in the seat of power in which country, but pretty much runs 7 decades long. How strong is this bond, and what is on the table today, given all that's happening in the world of geopolitics, especially with President Donald Trump?
Absolutely, Karthik. I think if you look at global alliances around the world, the India-Russia relationship has possibly been one of the most enduring relationships which has withstood test of time on multiple fronts. And I'm glad that now under the two leaders, this is going to take on a new dimension entirely. Because, so far, if you look at the Indian defense system, almost 60% of our equipment is from Russia. Until recently, India was a buyer. Now we have already become a co-partner. We are into R&D with them, joint development, production of critical equipment, like the BrahMos missile, for example. So I think this relationship is moving to a new trajectory altogether on multiple fronts, whether it is defense collaboration and also energy. Despite the US pressure, I think both the countries are very clear that energy is very important, both from a Russian point of view and Indian point of view, because of India's need for energy, because we are one of the largest and the fastest growing economies in the world today. So we can't do that unless we have access to cheap energy. But most importantly, Karthik, I think this is about India suggesting or telling the world that it's also about India's own strategic autonomy, that India will engage with different nations on its own terms and not be pressurized by any particular viewpoint or any particular agenda which doesn't fit in with India's own aspirations as a growing economy. So I think that's a very clear message that's going out from this meeting. And I think we will see this relationship becoming a really important relationship going forward, and probably one of the most defining features also of the new world order that's emerging, Karthik.
All right, Sri. Of course, a lot of things to discuss, from energy ties to security needs, especially the defense platforms that India still continues to rely on Russian equipment for. But we'll get into those specifics of trade, in just a little bit of time. But I want to first understand the messaging which is at stake here. And, Barnik, if I can invite you to join in before I go to, Ambassador Jayandas Gupta. First up, with Russia pretty much trying, not Russia trying, but in fact, the Western world trying to isolate Russia from the global economic and the geopolitical order. The messaging here that Vladimir Putin is not a pariah, the messaging that he has potentially friends and long-lasting friends with enduring relationships at a time when the West continues to look at President Vladimir Putin with suspicion, given the fact that the war in Ukraine and the peace plan proposed, the 28-point peace plan proposed by the US, has not really been signed as yet. What is on stake right now when it comes to messaging? Is it India's messaging to the US that, hey, tariffs, no tariffs, trade talks notwithstanding, we've got friends outside of the US as well that we can rely on? Or is it messaging by President Vladimir Putin that I'm not the one who's getting isolated? In fact, if anything, it might be Europe which is getting isolated at this point.
Yeah, so let's start with the Indian point of view. I think if you look at the warm welcome which the Indian Prime Minister accorded to President Putin, meeting him at the airport, and then the entire show of the Indian dancers, right? I think it is very clear that the Indians are not managing the visit, but celebrating this visit and celebrating this summit. This is a very important point because India wants to make clear that beyond even strategic autonomy, it is about economic interests of India. It is also about defense supply guarantees, which is far more important to India than just a partnership with the US. So, from the messaging from the Indian point is very clear. It's one of independence, it is one of leadership, and it is one of doing friendship with people based on strategic interests. And from the Russian point of view, there can be no better optics than this when the world's largest economy by population, and I think the fourth largest economy by dollars, is welcoming the Russian president with open arms, and is deepening its partnership both not only in defense and oil, but also to trade, which is expected to surpass $100 billion as the goal set by the summit by 2030.
That's right, Barnik.
Karthik, if I may just add to what Barnik said, I don't think, while this is definitely a celebration of a visit, but I don't think in any way India is saying that Russia is more important to us over US, because these are engagements that are happening on their own merit. US is important, definitely it's the world's most powerful, largest economy, so there is no way India is going to disengage or want to disengage with the US. That would be very stupid on our part. What we are saying is essentially is that there are relationships that are important to Russia, whether it is a US relationship, whether it is a Russian relationship, or even a Chinese relationship. All these relationships will be dealt with merit on a need basis from a Bharat first, an India first perspective. So I think this is not meant to alienate any specific country. We are not, for example, trying to alienate US with this meeting. This is the 23rd India-Russia meeting that's happening. I think it's India's desire is to strengthen relations with all the key allies. And India has not gone into any kind of a war or tariff war with any nation. I think it's basically the US which is putting pressure on India right now over the Russian energy oil purchase because the president there, President Donald Trump, wants a quick end to the Russia-Ukraine war. So I don't think India is really trying to distance itself from any particular nation by this engagement, Karthik. That's my viewpoint.
All right. Ambassador Jayandas Gupta, let's bring you into this conversation. And point well taken that Sri is making, that it's potentially not a trade-off. It's not that we want to align with Russia because we want to alienate the US. But would you then call it a fine balancing act that India is trying to do at this time, as India has continued to do over, let's say, the last decade or so, that India wants to protect its own national interests? Now, whether it is Russia, whether it is US, or whether it is any other FTA, let's say with UK, with EU, with the EFTA region, or with the, potentially the Eurasian region as well, India wants to protect its own national interests. And hence, In the context of geopolitics right now, in the context of Trump tariffs, India is trying to play that very, very fine balancing act at this moment.
I agree that it is a very strong message that is going out that Russia, maybe not, in the good books of the European Union, but we are continuing, for instance, with our FTA with the Europeans, and we are trying to finish it by January of next year. And similarly, in regard to the US, Russian oil is a contentious issue, but we will continue to deepen our relationship with Russia. And we will also try to strengthen our relationship with the US at the same time. So it is about strategic autonomy, it is about protecting our national interests, and also telling the world that we will have good relationship with all countries, on a bilateral basis. And we will try to sort out the differences, if any, that exist between, let's say, the US and India on the trade front by mutual negotiations. And it will not be allowed to escalate. So that is the message: strategic autonomy, national interest first, and we will keep all our options open, and we will try to have good relationships with all countries.
All right. So strategic autonomy, trying to maintain good relations with all economies, and of course protecting national interests. General Kulkarni, let's get a perspective, a defense and a strategic affairs perspective here, because India's dependence for its defense platforms, for its military platforms, is extremely high on Russia. Is there a chance that some of that could be offset by the upcoming trade negotiations with the US? And would it be in India's strategic interest, in India's national interest, to diversify its own military platforms beyond the dependence on Russia and potentially look at the US? And that happens to be one of the key asks of President Donald Trump.
Thank you, Karthik, and good morning to all my panelists. First and foremost, Karthik, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent national interests.
Right.
And keeping that in view, and in a multipolar world, it's extremely important that we have good relations with one and all. Not necessarily non-aligned, neither way aligned. It's a multipolar world. We have good relations with everybody. With Russia, well, even before independence, the diplomatic relations with Russia and then Soviet Union in India were on the 13th of April, 1947, even before the independence. So we've had fantastic, sustaining, with mutual respect, understanding each other. We've seen it in 47, 65, 71, and continuing thereon. The understanding by the Russians to say that, yes, Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India. The kind of vetoes it's been doing against various countries whenever it happened against India. So we find that the Russians have stood with India. India has stood with Russia, and that's a mutual respect. Now, as because the defense is concerned, definitely, at a point of time, we have 68% dependency on Russia because we found the Russian equipment well sturdier, one. Secondly, the barter system, thirdly, well acceptable. And there was mutual understanding. You find the HAL coming up in a huge way where we assemble the MiGs, we assemble the Sus. Now we find that the Sus have been given 66,000 crores for upgradation to ensure that they remain operational for the next 3 decades and modernized and updated, all in collaboration. So then when talks on Su-57, we saw in Operation Sindoor how BrahMos were handy, how S-400 were handy, how we hit the aircraft at over 300 kilometers. So things of those kind definitely enhance the understanding, the kind of relationship that we have with Russia. But definitely, the friendship with Russia is not at the cost of any country. That's for sure. No country can say my way or highway. That's not the way it is. It's a multipolar world. And in the multipolar world, it's important that we have good relations. Definitely, energy takes a huge stake. $68 billion trade, of which just we are exporting only $5 billion. Imports are worth about $63 billion. Obviously, $100 billion would involve a lot. But in the overall context of trade is concerned, definitely $100 billion do help us. There's no denying the fact. the most important is the trust, and the trust is what drives the relationship with Russia. And the trust is not just developed over a period of 2 decades or 3 decades. It's been over the years since independence, and that is what is important, I think. And the Putin visit, the bonhomie, the kind of friendship, that's personal chemistry. That's a force multiplier.
Absolutely.
That force multiplier helps in establishing good and conveys a good message to the world that, well, if you see Russia is a good friend of India, and India, irrespective of what happens in Ukraine, irrespective of the tariffs, irrespective of what the Americans might say, that energy will flow, and that energy will be translated into this positive energy which has now developed between India and Russia.
All right, energy will translate into positive energy. Let's bring in Mithali Nikore, and now let's actually get deeper into that entire energy conundrum, given the fact that there are sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, and incidentally, we also have the chairman of Rosneft as part of the Russian delegation here in India. Now, Mithali Nikore, the 100 billion trade pact by 2030, trade worth $100 billion, obviously a significant milestone. But the question really is about the trade balance, and the trade balance is tilting in favor of Russia and not in favor of India. Now, coming specifically to oil, for example, or let's diversify beyond oil. As of 2024-25, India's total trade with Russia was about $68 billion, out of which India's imports were about $63 billion and India's exports just shy of $5 billion. Now, even as we talk about expanding trade to $100 billion, India's got to shore up its own export potential as well. Now, are sectors like fertilizers and agri and fisheries going to be enough to offset the massive defense imports and potentially, the continued energy imports once, let's say, potentially the sanctions are lifted? Are we going to be in a position to balance that trade equation better in India's favor?
Thanks, Karthik, for bringing me into the conversation. And I think, when I'm looking at the scenario here in Gujarat, I've been working with a lot of industries here, and there's a sentiment of hope. There's a sentiment of optimism with this visit of the Russian president, simply because of the kind of geopolitical changes in the global value chains that have transpired this year. A lot of exporters here, for example, have diversified away from the US. They are looking for new markets. They've already sort of diversified away to the UK, even to East Asia. And, so with Surat and with Kandla and Mundra emerging as major sort of transit points from here in Gujarat, a lot of industries are saying this is a great opportunity for us to now think about the Russian market seriously. I'm pretty sure a similar sentiment is echoing across the manufacturing hubs in Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka, in Andhra Pradesh, in Maharashtra, and most of our country today, because we need new markets, and Russia happens to be a fast-growing economy. It happens to be a $1.5 billion economy. Now, the issue, of course, which a lot of the other panelists pointed out, is when you're doing this much trade with Russia, and when you're, angering, say, other geopolitical parties like the US or the EU or the UK that you're trying to do business with, how does that impact our trade, with these partners? And I think this is where India has to play not only a balancing act, but the act of a global leader. And this is exactly, I feel, what we will see over the next 2 days, where India can have an influence on Russia as one of its major oil purchasers, as one of its purchasers of several other defense equipment, and saying, let's move towards de-escalation, let's move towards peace, and let's usher in a new era of a multipolarity across the world, where global value chains are set in such a way that, India, China, Russia, the partners that came together during the SCO summit, can actually strengthen their trade ties, can actually bring in a lot more integration through investment as well as through manufacturing. We know that there are a lot of Russian businesses who want to come and invest in India, but because of Western sanctions, and because of the way the financial flows are being restricted, they are unable to come in and invest. So I think this is the time. The peace deal is already on the table. This is the time for Russia to also come in, de-escalate, and think about the economy. as opposed to the other sort of geopolitical aspects that are at play. I do think that the pharmaceuticals industry is also a very, very critical industry for this cooperation going forward, because the pharmaceutical industry in India is growing extremely fast. Again, we are looking for alternative markets in that sense.
Right.
So the pharmaceutical sector, very promising in this case.